Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us today. I'm Emily Sumner, and I'll be your host. Today's webinar is brought to you by Torch, an online learning and coaching platform that thousands of early learning organizations in 35 states are using to improve the use of evidence-based practices and boost outcomes for children. We are excited to be here today with our partners, the Literacy Architects. So I'm going to introduce our two presenters, Seema Tajura, who is founder and managing director of the Literacy Architects. Seema brings more than 12 years of experience leading students, teachers, and leaders toward literacy success. She's held various positions in urban school districts, including as reading specialist, literacy coach, reading language arts director, and chief academic officer. She has experience leading literacy programs for general education, ESL, and special education students. Seema is joined today by her colleague, Caitlin Deckard, who is a science of reading specialist with the Literacy Architects, and she's held various positions in rural and urban school districts, including elementary classroom teacher, literacy interventionist, gifted and talented teacher, RTI coordinator, strategic planning board member, and Title I services program coordinator. In her work, she prioritizes evidence-based practices within the MTSS framework while making research both accessible and approachable to educators. And that is our goal today, is diving into the science of reading, how to prepare our teachers to prepare our young learners to be strong readers in an accessible and approachable manner. So Seema and Caitlin have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to them.
Thanks so much, Emily. So welcome everyone to today's webinar on laying the foundation for strong literacy instruction. And I'd like to start actually with a story. So we're going to go on a journey. Follow me to a classroom in Florida. The year is 2003, and I've just graduated college. I'm spending the year there volunteering as an AmeriCorps member at an adult literacy center. And one day into the literacy center walks George. He takes off his hat and, in a very soft voice, introduces himself. He says, "Hi, I'm Big George." And he was born here in the States. He speaks perfect English, and he graduated from a local high school, actually. But he says that he can't read. So we bring him into the office. We administer a quick diagnostic assessment, and sure enough, even though he brought his high school diploma with him to show us, he cannot read most of the three-letter words that we put in front of him on this diagnostic assessment. So all of the things that you read this morning, he couldn't read. The road signs, cereal boxes, your Twitter feed, he couldn't read them. He says that a friend told him that we could help and that he'll do whatever it takes to learn how to read. So George is added to my schedule as a one-on-one student, and I start using an explicit, systematic, multisensory phonics program with him to review letter sounds and to teach him the basics of blending and segmenting. And a few weeks later, he's able to read like a whole list of CBC words. So he's reading them slowly, he's tapping them out, but he's reading them accurately. And at the end of this list of three-letter words, he stops, he looks up at me, and he asks, like, why didn't I learn this in school? I wasted so much time there. Why am I only learning this now? So this is why we're here today. So we're here to talk about the shifts that you can make to your literacy program now at the early literacy stage to prevent students from moving to the next grade, or even worse, graduating without having mastered the reading skills that they need. In our time together, we'll explore these three questions here. How does the science of reading support strong literacy instruction? How can practitioners utilize research to prioritize essential instructional shifts? And how can administrators support best practices? So the science of reading has been in the news a lot lately, so you might have heard about it, and you may be wondering if it's just the latest educational trend or swing of the pendulum. Well, remember my work with George? That was based in the science of reading, and it was over 20 years ago. And after that year with AmeriCorps, I went on to do my graduate studies to become a reading specialist. And in that program, I learned even more about the science of reading and all of the evidence that was out there. So while the research and evidence about how to teach students to read is not new, it is constantly expanding. So let's get into what researchers know about how we learn how to read. So take a look at what you see here. Written language has existed for less than 3% of human existence. This mind-boggling stat can help us understand why there's not just one part of the brain that's dedicated to reading like there are with other things that we do. For example, emotions, many gross motor movements, and decision-making are generally localized to one part of the brain, but reading isn't. Written language has not been around for most of human history. Our brains haven't yet adapted to the existence of written language and our need to process this type of language since it's so new, relatively speaking. So we actually have to create these circuits, and we create these connections in our brains through explicit and systematic instruction. And because there are 4 different parts of the brain that are working together when we read, it's often said that our brains aren't wired to read. So that means that instead of having just one part of the brain that's dedicated to reading that is naturally like turned on when we're born, our brain actually has to make connections between different parts of the brain in order to read. So reading isn't a skill that's going to develop naturally. If a human isn't exposed to written language and explicitly taught the skills needed to read and write, these brain connections and pathways between the 4 areas of the brain, they're not something that's going to develop on their own. So our brains aren't wired to read, right? Well, they are wired to talk. And so what I want you to take away from this section is how to capitalize on this and how this influences early reading instruction. Scientists have found from brain imaging studies that when we read, we are using 4 parts of the brain. If a human isn't exposed to written language and explicitly taught the skills needed to read and write, these brain connections and pathways between the 4 areas aren't something that's going to develop on their own. So we actually have to create those circuits, and we create those circuits between these 4 areas through explicit and systematic instruction. And this starts at the infant stage and then goes on through preschool. As we work to create these neural pathways, we only have so much available bandwidth. And this is why it's difficult for us to multitask. So another way to describe this phenomenon is cognitive load. In reading, this comes into play because at the end of the day, we need to understand what we read. That's the ultimate goal of reading. What's the point of reading words if we don't understand them? But if we're spending so much of our bandwidth or cognitive load on actually sounding out or decoding the words, like we see here in brain number 2, then there's just not enough energy left to actually understand what we're reading. So we actually need to shrink the amount of time and energy that we spend on decoding words so that we have more room available for comprehension. And the way to spend less time on decoding is to have a secure representation of letters, sounds, and words in our brain, and to be able to effortlessly recall these relationships while we're reading. That's what we call automatic word recognition. That's the goal. If students are accurately and automatically recognizing the words that they see, well, first they need to be able to decode those words. So what's required for a student to be able to decode? Well, they need to be able to look at the letters on a page and connect those letters to the sounds that they make. But that doesn't just happen at the snap of a finger. We start with phonemic awareness and letter recognition. These are the base skills that support students on their way to word recognition. So we'll take a closer look at both of these, starting off with the awareness of the sound structures in words. That awareness is called phonological awareness, which is the larger umbrella term that refers to the awareness of all of the different sound structures within a language. So for the most part, these phonological awareness sensitivities develop naturally. So as students learn how to talk and they're interacting with their caregivers at a young age, many students, many children will organically arrive at an awareness of language. In English, whole word awareness includes the understanding, for example, that the sentence, I have a cat, is made up of 4 words. That's word awareness. Syllable awareness is the understanding of spoken syllables. Cat with 1 syllable versus catnip with 2 syllables. Then we have alliteration, that the beginning sounds of words, cat, cake, and kite. And then we also have rhyming, cat, hat, bat. These are all fun ways to notice when words begin or end the same. And onset rhyme awareness allows us to break apart words into their first consonant sounds and then the rest of the words, like k, at. So these larger chunks, these larger phonological chunks, are what a lot of early educators have been trained to focus on with their youngest learners. However, newer research indicates that mastery over these larger chunks of sound aren't actually prerequisite skills for learning how to read. Actually, phonemic awareness is what we need to be focusing on. Phonemic awareness is different from the other phonological sensitivities in that it does not develop naturally. It's still part of phonological awareness, but it is essential to learning how to read. And it's not going to develop naturally. So while it can be tempting to think about overall phonological awareness as this nice progression from left to right, like you see on the screen here, it's important to know that phonemic awareness is not the final step in developing phonological awareness. Instead, it's a skill that you can start at any point in time, and it requires explicit instruction. This voice recording image for the word soon can help us kind of see why the awareness of individual phonemes can be difficult for students to learn and why explicit instruction is needed. So as you can see in this image, this is an audio image of the word soon. There aren't any spaces or breaks between the audio waves when the word soon is spoken. That's because when we speak, we co-articulate or we just smush our sounds together. That helps make our language comprehensible to the people who are listening to us. So we don't walk around speaking in phonemes. We don't say we just say hello. We smush it all together. Because if we're speaking in phonemes, that would be way too difficult to understand. So although the 44 sounds or phonemes in English are naturally part of their oral language as students speak every day, learning to separate the flow of speech and deconstruct words down to each phoneme in order to read and spell is actually not something that's natural to students. So it must be developed through direct instruction. In phonemic awareness, it's one of the strongest predictors of future reading success, and it has to do with our ability to hear and manipulate those individual sounds in words. The research on phonemic awareness is clear. It's critical to focus instruction on blending and segmenting phonemes, skills that mimic what is required to read and spell and write words. Skills that focus on larger units of language, such as counting words and sentences, rhyming, alliteration, all of those things we talked about when we talked about larger units of phonological awareness, those skills don't actually transfer to reading success. So in early literacy classrooms, we really want to be focusing on phonemic awareness. What should this look like? Well, it should look like isolating the first sound in words so that students become aware that words are made up of individual sounds. It should look like blending the sounds together to form words like students would do when they read. It should look like breaking apart the sounds in words like students would do when they spell. And as students become proficient with these phonemic awareness skills, they are better prepared to hear and manipulate the sounds in words when those sounds are then connected to written letters. And so now you may be thinking, how many of these sounds do students really have to learn to hear and manipulate? Well, the English language contains 44 different sounds, or 44 phonemes. These 44 phonemes can be tricky for students to parse out in everyday speech. And what's more, English orthography is very complex. So students are faced with the big challenge of making sense of these 44 isolated speech sounds. And then they need to match those 44 sounds to more than 200 ways to spell those sounds. The ultimate goal of explicit and systematic phonics instruction is to ensure that students have an awareness of the individual speech sounds and words and have mastery over all the different ways that these sounds can be spelled and combined to represent words. So here's the rub. We've got these two buckets of information that our early learners need to master in order to climb up the ladder towards automatic word recognition. We have phonemic awareness and we have alphabet recognition. In the typical early learning environment, you might see students working on these skills separately, maybe as a whole group alphabet lesson or at a different center literacy station for each skill. Or maybe students are called to the teacher table to work on either phonemic awareness or alphabet recognition, one thing or the other. However, research shows us that instruction is more effective when teachers are explicit about the connection between phonemic awareness and letters. So they need to clearly address how these two skills are connected to each other.
Now, this can be a really huge shift for practitioners that may be used to keeping phonemic awareness separate from letter instruction during different parts of a lesson or even during different parts of the school day. But research is really clear that linking this instruction has really powerful effects on student reading outcomes. Because of this can be such a big shift for our teachers, they're likely to need a lot of support and coaching to actually put this research into practice. Let's take a look at how can be structured within the context of instruction. So phonemic awareness instruction and phonics instruction can really stagger one another in explicit ways that allows the students to apply their skills in context. So take the skill of phoneme isolation. First, we would introduce students to phonemes, say, and we would practice producing these sounds and isolating these sounds, perhaps using sound boxes and picture cards and other manipulatives. And then after students have displayed some mastery over isolating these sounds, we can strengthen their application of phonemic awareness by having our students read and spell the graphemes that represent those same sounds. Now consider the skill of phoneme blending. First, we may invite students to practice auditorily blending CVC words. T, b. And after practice, the student can successfully synthesize those sounds into the word tub. And again, after they've displayed some mastery over that blending strategy, we can strengthen their application of phonemic awareness by having them now practice reading the word tub. We can follow a similar model with the skill of phoneme segmentation. So we might ask students to segment all the sounds in the word slip or break all of those sounds apart, which can already feel particularly tricky because there's that consonant blend hidden at the beginning of the word. And then after students have displayed some mastery over segmenting words with this pattern, we can solidify the application of this phonemic awareness skill by having them actually spell the word slip, putting that pencil to paper. Research has shown that really linking phonemic awareness and letter instruction helps learners apply phonemic awareness more effectively when they're actually reading and spelling. The classroom implications of this finding is really significant. If teachers stagger phonemic awareness and letter knowledge instruction, they can really maximize their instructional time while making stronger connections for their students. Now, while it might be tempting to think that instructional shifts like this can be implemented as soon as teachers have this new knowledge, this really isn't too realistic. Research suggests that it can take from 2 to 4 years to fully and successfully implement evidence-based programs, practices, or effective innovations. From learning the why behind the science of reading to navigating a new curriculum and everything in between, implementation takes time, and implementation of evidence-based literacy instruction is not just 1 or 2 quick swaps. We're talking about really large shifts in practice to really align to research, such as focusing on phonemic awareness instead of larger phonological units like spoken syllables or rhyming, which are not necessary for literacy instruction. We're talking about granular changes that really make a big difference for learners, like pronouncing phonemes accurately instead of distorting the sound, such as pronouncing the sound that's represented by the letter P as instead of P. This is a really big and difficult shift for teachers to make, even though it's super tiny and sounds really simple. We're also talking about scope and sequence shifts, like moving away from letter of the week to spiraling our alphabet instruction so that students can get repeated exposures of all of the alphabet letters throughout the school year. Now, this big question of really turning science of reading knowledge into effective implementation is the question that we are working to answer here at the Literacy Architects and in partnership with the great team at Porsche. Now, it's with this question in mind that we've designed our professional learning through the lens of this framework that you see here on the screen, Professional Learning Cycle for Successful Implementation. This is a PD solution that aligns with the research on adult learning. So our flipped approach to professional development uses a mix of weekly PLC meetings and asynchronous learning to provide teachers with the time and space to learn and adapt strategies to their specific classroom, collaborate with grade level peers, and work towards full implementation of literacy routines that align with the science of reading. Since we know how much teachers have on their plate, really being respectful of their time is imperative. So in our professional development model, we know that we're asking teachers to do a lot for them to log on with us every single week. And what we don't want to do is make this time feel tedious or like it's a waste and they could be doing something better. So we prioritize peer-to-peer collaboration over facilitator talking, planning an upcoming lesson versus just thinking about theory, and practicing instructional routines in a safe place with colleagues versus empty action planning. Teachers, like any learner, only have so much bandwidth for professional learning. That's why all of our professional development is respectfully supportive of adult learners while really making implementation possible. This type of deep and meaningful training is desperately needed. Research has found that educators are commonly lacking in the same basic knowledge that they're responsible for teaching to their students. One study found that teachers accurately segmented less than a quarter of the words represented to them. And this skill deficit is really of little surprise when considering that 2/3 of teacher prep programs do not adequately address phonemic awareness with future teachers. Without appropriate professional learning and ongoing support, students are not likely to master a skill that their teacher hasn't yet learned. However, teacher knowledge is not the only barrier to implementation of best practices. 1 in 5 teachers report not using their district purchased curriculum, Among the top reasons for not using a curriculum are that it didn't meet their students' needs. It was too difficult to implement, and a lack of time to use and incorporate these new materials. Ensuring that all stakeholders are involved in the curriculum adoption process is really essential, especially when it comes to selecting a curriculum that is both manageable to implement and aligned to the research on early learning best practices. In addition to that intentional curriculum selection process, research has a lot to say as well about how to support effective implementation of best practices. Time and training is one way to do this. A review of the research on practices that led to learning found that deliberate practice with feedback, effort, and significant time resulted in powerful learning gains for both adults and students. This type of learning simply can't happen in a drive-by workshop or one-off presentation. Coaching and support is also necessary and highly impactful. The effects of coaching on achievement are also larger than almost all other school-based interventions, including student incentives, teacher pre-service training, merit-based pay, general PD, and extended learning time. Buy-in and voice can also make a really powerful impact. One 2017 study showed that teacher leadership and the amount of teacher influence in school decision-making are independently and significantly related to student achievement. With all of these best practices in mind, we'd like to leave you with our gratitude for your commitment to the students that you serve. The future readers of tomorrow are lucky to have you in their corner, really advocating for the instruction that they need to succeed in today's literacy-rich world. Now, we will turn it back over to the team at Torch.
Well, thank you so much, Seema and Caitlin, for this great overview about the science of reading and how we need to support our early educators in learning this approach. So it's been fascinating. We do have a lot of questions from the audience, but I'm going to give you both just a minute to take a sip of water and a quick breath before we get to those questions. And I do want to quickly thank Torch for sponsoring today's webinar. And I really want to encourage you all to explore the professional learning program that Caitlin reviewed, Literacy Masterminds. This is a partnership between the Literacy Architects and Torch, and it's for early learning and K-12 organizations. As Caitlin mentioned, it's a really unique approach to professional learning, and it uses a mix of weekly PLC meetings and asynchronous learning opportunities to help your team develop a deep knowledge of research-based literacy instruction and how to implement it in your classrooms, particularly while educators are on the job. It's a job-embedded approach, which really has a big impact. So you can learn more about Literacy Masterminds at the URL on your screen, which is torch.com/early-literacy. All right, let's get to some of our questions. We will start with ones that have come in at the top. This individual is with a state agency, education agency, and they're focusing on science of reading for K-12. And are just wondering how what you've walked through here, which had the early literacy focus, aligns to the K-12 levels of education.
Yeah, sure. I can take this one. So when we're talking about, I'm assuming, so for pre-K and where does that fall into the science of reading continuum? So when we're talking about kindergarten readiness, we want to make sure that we're talking about explicit and systematic phonemic awareness and letter knowledge instruction, because that's going to set students up for success. So like we mentioned, the phonemic awareness and letter knowledge instruction should be connected. So phonemic awareness is more effective when there's alphabet letters attached to it. So we want to keep that in mind. And these two skills are really what's most essential when we're talking about what students need to become proficient decoders. We also want to talk about oral language and vocabulary building and knowledge building as well. But when we're talking about decoding and word recognition, we're looking at phonemic awareness and letter knowledge.
Great. I think that's helpful. And I think that's definitely an issue many folks are struggling with. I think a lot of attention has been spent on science of reading in K-12, but that kindergarten readiness is that platform into that next level. So great. This is another one I think a lot of folks are struggling with. There's all the research out there supporting science of reading, but their pre-K curriculum is not aligned to this research. So what steps do you have recommend that they can take to adopt a new one?
This is such a great question, Emily. So I'll speak a little bit to this. One thing that you absolutely have to do is make sure that your curriculum selection committee is really trained and knowledgeable in the science of reading. They can't pick something that they don't know what it looks like. So make sure that you have that baseline training for the members of that team, and make sure that that team is also really comprised of diverse stakeholders. We want people from all areas of education providing their insight, because they do know their learners best. And so we want to make sure that all of those voices are heard and represented in your selection process. That's also going to support with the buy-in process after you've adopted that curriculum. If people are invested in it because they had the opportunity to have a say in the curriculum that was chosen, they're going to be more likely to implement it with fidelity. The other thing that you might want to keep in mind too is there are a lot of curriculum review resources that are out there and are really great to take information from as you're making this selection process. The Reading League has a great free tool that you can use to work through a curriculum and decide whether or not it's aligned. It's a great checklist, and it's very, very detailed. Ed Reports is also a great free resource that you can use. And it's a really good place to start, but you still want to make sure that it aligns to the needs of your specific learning community. One word of caution is if you're going to be using state approved lists, these state approved lists often come with big warning labels that are more provided in the form of like fine print. So if you are working off of a state approved list, do make sure that you read all of the reviews very thoroughly, because oftentimes there are big disclaimers about practices within a curriculum that are not aligned to the science of reading.
Those are great. All great, helpful hints. And I think your point about all of those resources are wonderful starting places, and then really needing to make sure that it fits the needs of and goals of your community and your learners. It's definitely not a small task, but there are a lot of resources out there to help guide that review and selection and then implementation process, which is a whole nother piece of it. So and speaking of big processes, one of our participants notes that there's just a lot for our pre-K teachers to learn, and just wondering where do you start when you're biting this off?
Yeah, there absolutely is a lot to learn when it comes to the science of reading. Our recommendation is to do not try to do it all at once. So step by step, start by remembering what your ultimate goal is. So ultimately, the goal of literacy instruction is to support our students in becoming independent, proficient readers and to comprehend what they read. So we would recommend you learn about the science behind the reading brain and what the brain actually needs to be able to learn how to read. And then just start to sift through what's essential and what do your teachers and practitioners already know, and what gaps might they have in the research and evidence that you can fill in through professional development. and look at the highest impact practices and skills. So today we talked about phonemic awareness and letter knowledge, but then also look at what students need to develop their language comprehension as well, like vocabulary, background knowledge, syntax. All of these can be developed starting with oral language at the pre-K level. And then finally, we recommend that you not try to tackle this on your own. So find a community to support the journey. Just like students need that social interaction to really learn and cement information, adults need that as well. And our communities of practice allow those adult learners to bounce ideas off of each other, to get suggestions, and to get their challenges talked through with their peers. So a community like that can be really beneficial when trying to learn about this expansive research and evidence base.
Yeah, and I think that community really helps bring down the stress level too. People can share those experiences, know that they're not alone going through it, and support each other. So that is a really important part of it. And to your earlier point, take it step by step. It's a big thing, but it's doable, and you can make this shift. So. Excellent question coming up regarding where do assessments fit into the science of reading and instruction for our educators?
I'll take this one, Emily. This is such a great question because one of the things that we're constantly thinking about when it comes to structured literacy is how to make our instruction diagnostic and responsive to the needs of students. For this data question, we really love using CBMs or curriculum-based measures here because they are really, really quick. They take about 1 minute to administer, which is great because we know teachers don't have a lot of time. They are accurate. There's a lot of research behind them, and they're reliable. And if we're thinking about our earliest learners, this initial sound isolation is a really great tool to use when we're just starting out with the idea of phonemic awareness. One thing that is super fun with those early learners, you can just kind of see how that explicit instruction is really, really necessary. I had a pre-K student that I was working with several years ago that I asked, well, what's the first sound in the word dog? And they say woof, and you just know, like, oh, that's so adorable. They don't know yet, which is why we're going to give them explicit instruction. But then you do that same probe later on in their learning journey, and they're able to tell you that first sound is d, and you're like, yes, we have done it. So there's a lot of growth that can be shown in our diagnostic data, even from this early age. When it comes to letter knowledge, you can use letter sound and letter naming fluency tools that are also quick in 1 minute. Just a word of caution on that. We do want to make sure that we're measuring all the things that our learners know. And so when it comes to the 26 alphabet letters, you might consider untimed diagnostics because there's a good chance that it's going to take a bit longer than a minute there.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think it's so important to remember we as humans do not all learn at the same pace. So having that data really helps be able to guide that instruction for each of our kiddos, and making sure that they're all getting the support that they need to get that kindergarten readiness when it comes to reading. So all right. It looks like we're getting close on time, so we'll take one more question. And Seema, you did touch on this, but we'll just go ahead and ask just for some additional strategies in terms of best ways to support our teachers in implementing new practices such as these. So there's kind of there's the learning part of it, the knowledge part of it, and then the practice part of it.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question again. So really our focus here would be on making sure that the training or the professional development that teachers are being provided with is actionable. So theory is nice to learn about, but you really want to make sure that your PD is leaving your instructors and practitioners with practical steps that they can use in their classrooms the next day. And along with that, bite-sized implementation. So a full day of training might be easier for administrators to schedule than weekly PLC meetings, but a 6-hour training like that would have a lot of information packed into it, and then teachers are often left on their own to then figure out, well, how do I implement everything that I just learned about? So breaking things down for instructors can be so helpful, which is why actually our PD has that weekly cadence. So it's bite-sized and digestible, and teachers are trying things out every week and then coming back to troubleshoot. And then again, just the follow-up support is so key. So making sure that teachers have access to someone knowledgeable who can help them action plan, problem solve, talk through student data with, that follow-up support when you're implementing new practices and learning about new instructional routines is so key to success.
Yeah, just like we said with those professional learning communities, learning with your fellow educators, but then also that one-on-one coaching support of like what's actually happening in your classroom. How did this routine go? What went well? Where can we continue to improve? Has such an impact on the effectiveness of these strategies, but also our educators' confidence, which is an important part of it. So. Well, thank you for fielding all these questions. Thanks for everyone who submitted such great questions and guiding that conversation. I want to thank Seema and Caitlin again for being here with us and for sharing so much valuable and useful information as we look to embed these practices into our programs. Before we sign off, I would like to introduce John Williams with Torch, and he's going to just share a little bit more about Torch's partnership with the Literacy Architects and how the Torch online professional learning and coaching platform supports educator learning and effectiveness. So welcome, John.
Hi, this is John Williams with Torch. We're so excited to be partnering with the Literacy Architects, who provide virtual training, guidance, and coaching in the area of evidence-based literacy instruction. For over a decade, Torch has been providing technology solutions that support coaching and professional learning across the United States and across the world. This exciting partnership has led to this new solution that's available to you today. The backbone to this partnership is the Torch Talent Platform, which combines all the key elements and aspects of coaching and professional learning. Whether it's coaching, mentoring, or technical assistance, collaborative learning and teaming, training and professional development, along with the use of data and insights, Torch Talent combines all these together to support learning and growth. Many of our partners have seen tremendous results in using the Torch Talent platform. Research has shown that it does increase reach and capacity for our partners, while also allowing them to increase the dosage of coaching and professional learning that they provide. To learn more about this exciting partnership, please contact us below.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you all so much for joining us today. We appreciate all you do to support young learners and set them up for lifelong success, and all you do to support our pre-K teachers. We hope all of you will explore the Literacy Masterminds professional learning program. We'll be sharing more information about that with you in the coming days, as well as the recording of the webinar. So we hope you enjoy all of that, and please feel free to reach out. We've got contact information and social channels up there on the screen, and we welcome your questions and are looking forward to supporting you in your work. So everyone enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.